You are ready.
Okay, am I missing a commissioner? There we go. Very good. Thank you, David. With that, I will call to order this special meeting of the West Hollywood Planning Commission. It is Thursday, July 29th at 6:30 p.m. But first, our magic sing-along sheet. This special planning commission meeting is being held in compliance with California Governor Gavin Newsom's executive order to protect public health and prevent the spread of COVID-19. This planning commission meeting is being conducted via teleconference on the city's website. It is also provided on a wide array of streaming media platforms to offer access to the public to the fullest extent possible. WehoTV staff have confirmed that this planning commission meeting is currently streaming successfully on Spectrum Channel 10 and online at weho.org/WehoTV. In addition, and as a courtesy, this meeting is also successfully streaming on the city's YouTube channel at youtube.com/WehoTV and on Roku, Apple TV, Fire TV, and Android TV. WehoTV staff monitor this broadcast on all platforms throughout the meeting and will notify the Planning Commission Secretary should the broadcast disruptions arise. And speaking of disruptions, I apologize for the feline in the background making noise. Please do not interrupt the live meeting unless you're a cat by calling or texting the planning commissioners about difficulties viewing the meeting. If you are experiencing viewing difficulties while watching this live stream, please reload the page or visit weho.org/WehoTV to access our official live stream and to visit a list of other streaming options. In addition, you may call in to listen to this meeting by dialing 669-900-6833, and the meeting ID is 964-6879-2559, and press the pound sign. Please understand that internet speeds, device reliability, third-party platform reliability, and individual or personal technical issues are out of the scope of this broadcast. WehoTV staff has published a guide at weho.org/WehoTV to troubleshoot your connection. If you are having difficulties connecting to the meeting, you can also call 323-848-3151. And with that, we will move on to item 2, the Pledge of Allegiance. Can I ask our esteemed attorney, Ms. Langer, to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
Sure. Okay. Hand over your heart, repeat after me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Lauren. David, would you please call the roll?
Thank you. Good evening, commissioners. Tonight we have 2 commissioners that are absent as excused. That will be Commissioner Thomas and Commissioner Vinson. So the action minutes and any roll call votes will reflect that. Commissioner Lombardi.
Here.
Commissioner Odetta.
Here.
Commissioner Cavallero.
Here.
Vice Chair Jones.
Here.
Chair Hoopengarner.
Here.
And we have a quorum.
Thank you, David. Item 4, approval of the agenda. Do we have a motion to approve this agenda? So moved by Vice Chair Jones. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Thank you, Commissioner Cavallero. David, would you please call the vote?
Thank you. Commissioner Lombardi.
Yes.
Commissioner Odetta.
Yes.
Commissioner Cavallero.
Yes.
Vice Chair Jones.
Yes.
Chair Hoopengarner.
Yes.
And the agenda is approved as presented.
Thank you, David. Item 5, approval of the minutes. These are the minutes of the July 15th, 2021 Planning Commission meeting. Do we have a motion to approve the minutes? So moved, Vice Chair Jones. Thank you. Second again, Commissioner Cavallero. And David, once more with feeling, the roll call vote.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner Lombardi,
Yes.
Commissioner Odetta,
I'll abstain.
thank you. Commissioner Carvalero,
Yes.
Vice Chair Jones,
Ye-
Chair Hoopengartner,
Yes.
and the minutes are approved as presented for July 15th, 2021, showing Commissioner Odetta abstaining and Commissioner Thomas and Commissioner Vincent absent.
I am moving on to item 6, public comment. At this time, the public is allowed to speak on any items they wish to present to this planning commission with a maximum speaking time of 3 minutes. David, do we have public?
Chair, I received no public comments for this item. If there's anybody on the platform with us that would like to speak, just hit *9 for me at this time. And it looks like we're all clear for this item, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to item 7, excuse me, Director's Report. Mr. Kehoe.
Good evening, everyone. John Kehoe, Director of Planning and Development Services. Just a couple of updates. At the last City Council meeting, the City Council did approve the digital billboard at 9157 Sunset. And that did include a small logo on the frame of the sign that was added. The applicant requested that after the Planning Commission meeting was presented to the council. The council discussed it, including whether or not it should go back to Planning Commission. The council ultimately approved it. On the next council meeting on August 2nd, there are 3 items that would be of interest to the Planning Commission. The first is the billboard, the static billboard at 8752 Sunset Boulevard. That's at the Everly, that's at the Everly restaurant. The zone text amendment for the urban arts program is on that agenda. And then also, as I've mentioned before, the post-pandemic land use action plan. So just as a reminder, we are all hoping that this pandemic will end at some point. And when the emergency rules and regulations are lifted, we will need to have a plan for how we transition all the activities that moved out into the sidewalks and parking spaces into some sort of new normal. And so this is the beginning of that discussion where the City Council will give us direction on how much we would like to retain, how much we'd like to go back to the way it was, and start the process. And that would more than likely potentially include some changes to our regulations that might come through the Planning Commission. And with that, that's all I have for right now.
John, I just have one quick question. And thank you for that. Do we have an update on when we will be going back to in-person meetings?
No, we don't. Unfortunately, they were hoping to have the City Council meeting as in-person or a hybrid on, I think it was the last week. And unfortunately, they did not have it in person.
Okay. I know that staff will, and David is amazing, but I just wanted to ask that, because people are kind of planning vacations again, et cetera, that we just have a heads up about that so people can plan
At any
accordingly.
rate,
Thank you.
And at any rate, we would be after the City Council. So
Right. Okay.
the City Council
Okay.
will go first, and then we would be after that.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions for staff? There being none, let's move on to item 8, items from commissioners. No. Commissioner Lombardi.
Sure, yeah, just a few quick things. So last week I attended the environmental impact EIR scoping meeting for 9160, 9176 Sunset Boulevard. That's currently a Jaguar dealership. Commercial and retail office building, new construction with a potential digital artwork and digital billboard component as well. Just wanted to say it was really nice to see such extensive community turnout. There were many on the call, and I took a lot of detailed notes, and there was a lot of excellent feedback there. So just wanted to note that. Also yesterday, I attended Dr. Robin DiAngelo's Radical Justice Conversation, and I found that to be very informative. Just to be really succinct, I think we all have a lot of work to do. I know I do, and we should constantly look for improvement. I think for me, my takeaway from the conversation was motivation to become a more active participant in these challenging discussions, and in particular, when a questionable situation may arise. Those are my comments.
Thank you. Anyone else? Vice Chair Jones.
I may raise my hand for every item during this meeting that I can. I just want to give everybody a heads up. I just wanted, it's very well said, Commissioner Lombardi. I do just want to second that echo that I also attended the conversation last night. I found her to be incredibly warm and engaging. It's not, a wonder that she is, so beloved by her students. But I think, why can't she be the one on television being a pundit? She was really great. But I think I also want to give a shout out to Yvonne Corker and to Robin Eason. It is not lost on me that a lot of times in conversations like this, that it sometimes falls upon our Black colleagues to facilitate learning. And I don't always want that to be the case because we need to hold up our end of the bargain here. But I do want to thank Robin and Yvonne for attending and for helping to facilitate, and Yvonne for moderating, and also to Aaron Hammett for kind of getting everything set up and providing instructions. I'm sure many people were texting before being like, I can't get in. So it was great.
If there's nothing else, I will third your motion. The seminar last night was really excellent. I thought Yvonne did a great job engaging and making it a conversation, which is, for someone who does public speaking, doing it in a void is just a nightmare. And to have it more of a conversation made it much more accessible, I think, for those of us attending. And I think the format made for a good conversation without anybody talking. And I do believe for the public, if you're interested, maybe someone from staff can help. Robin, if you're here, I know we were sent a link to access it. Is it something that's available to the public?
No, for copyright issues and content privacy, it is not available to the public, but we do have some things in the works that'll be coming that'll be more community oriented in the coming months. So we'll announce those as they are ready to be shared.
And in the meantime, I would certainly recommend Dr. DiAngelo's book on white fragility. So that said, if there's no other items from commissioners, let's move on to item 9. Consent calendar, there is none. Item 10, public hearings, there is none. Item 11, new business, there is none. Item 12, unfinished business. The housing element update, the draft element. This is a receive and comment and provide feedback for the city council session. There will be no voting, but we will have a staff presentation during which we will have discussion, and we will have a public comment session. Now, having said that, I know, Rachel, when we spoke earlier in the day, you had discussed about you were going to break this up and have, presentation, comment, presentation, comment. I'm not sure how to integrate that with public comment. If we wait till the very end with public comment, that may be the only way to do it.
We certainly could take it before the presentation as well. I know that's atypical, but that's one option. I'm not sure if we have any public commenters as of yet.
I wouldn't feel comfortable with asking people to comment on something that hasn't been presented. So I think at this point, we'll just have to go through the entire presentation and then go to public comment, unless anyone else has any brainstorms. So with that, Rachel, you're on deck.
Great. Thank you so much. Good evening, Commission, Vice Chair and Chair. Thank you so much this evening. My name is Rachel Diamond. I'm a Senior Planner in the Long Range Planning Division. And tonight we are going to talk about the housing element update. We have a number of additional team members on this evening that are also here to join in on the presentation and are also available for questions and comment later. And like the chair said, what we'll do is kind of go through in little sections and take breaks for comment. You're welcome to comment throughout and ask questions throughout the presentation when we take little breaks, or you can save everything for the end. Either way works for us. So like I said, we have a number of project teammates on this presentation tonight, including Allison Bartle from Community Services. Brian Eck and Gurdeep Kaur are also planners that are on the project. We have Veronica Tam, who's our lead consultant from Veronica Tam and Associates, and she'll be joining in on the presentation shortly. And then we also have Ryan Russell, Housing Element Associate from Rincon on the call tonight as well, but also from Rincon are Suzanne Huerta and Sarah Howland representing the project. Tonight, we're going to walk through really quickly the steps that we've completed thus far to get to where we are today, particularly the community engagement that have been conducted recently since we last came to the Planning Commission. And then really we'll go through the actual draft housing element. The housing element itself is really the key item here, but there's also a number of additional attachments and appendices to that we'll discuss as well.
Rachel, I do want to interrupt you here and announce to the public that for those of you who only downloaded the original agenda, there have been 2 very large supplemental additions that have been uploaded to the website. So please go get those, because those have been, one was even uploaded late today. So it's hard for us to communicate to public when there's more and more stuff. So I just want to make sure you're aware of that for the public, because some of that stuff is what I think is going to be addressed in Rachel's discussion. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Oh, that's okay. Thank you so much. And in addition to being able to access those documents where the agenda for this meeting is, the actual draft documents are now housed on our website, weho.org/housing element, where we have a draft of the overall document available for public consumption right now. And just to go through, we have a number of discussion questions that are going to be posed throughout the presentation. And so we'll pause for those, and then we'll talk about some next steps in the process. So there are a number of steps completed. Obviously we were given a final RENA allocation from SCAG. And that's really one of the key driving pieces of the housing element, in that we're given an allocation of a number of units that we're trying to plan for and show capacity for over the next 8 years, and ultimately in a slight shift, develop our policies related to housing over this next housing cycle. So once that allocation was finalized, that's really when the city kicked our process into high gear to amend the housing element, which, as you know, is required by the state. The city convened a task force of 10 experts in the housing field, and 3 meetings were completed as of this Monday. We had the 3rd meeting where they weighed in on the draft element itself. And so we included in a supplemental that was sent out today the summary of all of the community engagement, and that includes a summary of that recent task force meeting this past Monday. And I'll speak a little bit about that towards the end of this presentation. The city also had 2 community surveys to reach out to the community for their input, as well as 3 community workshops to engage the community on a number of housing topics. There were also coordinated interviews with city departments and advisory groups where the city engaged in all areas and specialties throughout the city to gain insights into how we can better shape this housing element update. And in order to develop the environmental impact report, there was a notice of preparation that included 2 scoping meetings, one on May 11th and one on May 25th. That helped kick off the EIR process. And as we get further down the road with the certification of this element, we'll also see the actual EIR that we're still working on. And then the meetings with Planning Commission and Council, obviously we're here now to talk to the Planning Commission, and ultimately we'll go back to the City Council at their September 20th meeting prior to submitting this draft to HCD that they'll have to review prior to final adoption. So while you have seen portions of this in the past, and at this point, we're now showing you the draft itself, we're not looking for adoption of the draft. We're looking for comments from you. We're looking for any input or questions. And then ultimately, this draft will move forward to HCD prior to actual voting on a recommendation, which will happen for Planning Commission, most likely in early December of this year. So the housing element itself is not that large of a document as compared to the technical background report that's added on. That's hundreds of pages. That includes all of the background information. The housing element includes all the statutory requirements as required by state, as well as relationship to other general plan elements. And this is something that is really important to make sure that all the general plan elements work well together. So you'll see in the future when we come back with certification, we'll likely come back with a few minor changes to other elements to address the changes in the housing element update itself. Then we get into context and strategies, and this is where we talk about our changing housing needs in the city, our aging housing stock, as well as the state of our existing affordable housing and kind of how much we have on the ground. The housing element then gets into goals and policies, and then delves even deeper into housing programs, really helping us achieve our goals themselves. And then, like I said, the technical background report includes a massive wealth of information, including all the community outreach information, the needs assessment, which includes the sites inventory, housing constraints, really detailed, as well as, like I said, the summary of public comments that was provided to you in that in the supplemental today, review of past accomplishments, which is something that's been required by the state, where we check in each year about how we're doing on our goals. And then the Appendix C, Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing, which Veronica Tam will delve a little bit further into today as well. So just to go through the context and strategies aspect of the housing element itself, like I said, there's kind of three key pieces that are addressed: the changing housing needs, aging housing stock, and existing affordable housing. For changing housing needs, basically, the city really needs to provide affordable housing and alternative housing arrangements through both new construction and adaptive reuse in order to create a wealth of different types of housing types, including assisted living, residential care, co-housing, shared homes. So definitely addressing types of housing that we haven't in the past and coming up with ways to address and to achieve some of those housing types. We also have a deeply aging housing stock. And I think this this tidbit and fact is really telling to say that 93% of the city's housing stock is at least 30 years old. So only 7% of our housing is less than 30 years old. And so when you really let that sink in, you recognize that we do have a dramatically aging housing stock that we need to invest in, or understand that there also are, certain projects that are ripe for redevelopment and addressing how we kind of funnel projects into those different places where we can preserve buildings and help to improve them and deal with their aging housing stock issues, but also redevelop the city to build new affordable housing. And again, existing affordable housing, we've got 16,581 rent stabilized units in the city. 1,000 are publicly assisted rental housing units, and 720 households in the city receive Section 8 vouchers. And so looking at whether we have enough units in those categories and ways to shift into more affordable categories in the city. So when we review the context and strategies, this is where I wanted to do a quick break. I know we haven't gone too deep into the housing element itself, but just wanted to check in, and this kind of covers a little bit more than what I just reviewed, but there are, a number of descriptions that I just described, and, do those accurately depict your experience in West Hollywood? And I think, understanding the way that we address current conditions, does that reflect West Hollywood's most important housing needs? And is there anything missing from that? So I wanted to open it up to the commissioners and see if anyone has any comments or questions at this time related to context and strategies.
Thank you, Rachel. Before we get there, would you point us to the area of the technical background report that includes the data around the age of the housing stock, as well as the tables around the percent of the units that are rent stabilized?
Sure. If someone else from staff could actually answer that question, it's a little challenging for me to look at the document while sharing my screen for the presentation. I'm happy to come back to that, but I believe it's the first section of the technical background report in the existing conditions, and the first 5 or 6 tables give you graphics.
That starts on page 43 is where we really dig into the aging, housing age and condition. And then the rent stabilization section is after that. But they're not exactly all from the same section, and hence the slide to kind of give some larger bullet points, since the TBR is such a massive document.
Yes, thank you. I just want to have people have access to where that data is that you're referring to. So page 43 is the data regarding the age of the housing stock, and the number of units and the percent of units that are rent stabilized is on page. I don't know.
You'll give me just a moment.
I may be looking at the wrong document. I don't think I am. I have the age of housing stock as being on page 48 of the technical report.
I'm looking at physical page 43, not PDF page 43.
Got it. Okay, thank you. I would be looking at page 42 then. That's my bad.
For page 43, I didn't get to see. Okay, so that's page 43, and then, because I think these are two pieces of information that get to the heart of where do we stand now, and that guides where do we go. So I just want to make sure people have access to this data.
Yeah, and then in the technical background report, starting on page 103, and that's the actual numbered page 103. I think that's most helpful, since the PDF version, I'm just looking at 103, and that's where we dig into the rent stabilization ordinance and bring up the history of that program and the number of units in that program.
I don't think so. My 103 is small buildings and condominium conversion ordinance.
I think it's 102.
Yes, rent stabilization ordinance. Yes, that's the ordinance. Does that have the data? 2018, 111,000 rent stabilized units, but as a percentage of total, is there a table somewhere that breaks down the units?
We don't have a table, no.
Okay.
It's all part of a paragraph description. There's no table.
Okay. All right. Okay. I just wanted to make sure that we were all singing off the same sheet of music before we move forward. Okay, with that, are there additional questions for staff at this time? Commissioner Lombardi?
Yeah, just one. Chair Hoopengarner, you actually asked some of the same questions I was going to have. I highlighted the approximately 93% of the city's housing stock, at least 30 years of age, which to me, 30 years is kind of young for a building in some regards. So it's good to see the data in the technical report that kind of breaks out a little bit more detail about what age those actually are. So thank you for that. One thing that I had here, because I feel like not everyone may know what we're all talking about. There's a comment about soft, weak, open face structures. And I just wonder if there should be a little more description of what that is or what's going on there for people that might not know. I know there's some information on the city's website on that too.
We can definitely delve into that further.
Okay.
Okay, any other questions at this time?
Yeah, I had a question. Just kind of compare the current housing element to this one. The current one mentions that there's 1,147 publicly assisted rental housing units, and then the update mentions 1,056. Can you explain why those numbers changed? Was affordability on some properties, did it expire? And the same thing with the number of voucher holders changed pretty significantly between the current housing element and then what is being proposed right now.
Yeah, I can start with the vouchers. That's really the easy one. So the city is not a housing authority. We do not have the ability to give vouchers. All of the vouchers within the city are held by current residents in the form of a tenant-based voucher that goes with them. So if they leave the city of West Hollywood, you know, that voucher travels with them, or they're project-based vouchers that are assigned to a specific 100% affordable unit. And so the city, in terms of the 100% affordable buildings, obviously those vouchers are remaining in the city because the buildings don't move. But the folks that have a voucher, that comes and goes with them. So if they exit the city for whatever reason, the voucher travels with them. And because we aren't a housing authority, our vouchers come from the county, and you know, we can't really offset and offer more vouchers. We don't control them. And then in terms of the number, in terms of loss of units, we can look into that. I don't know offhand the shift in that.
Okay, so with the vouchers, the assumption can be that people just moved out and took their vouchers with them. Okay.
Yes.
And then I know in the document in a couple places there's reference to affordable housing that exists naturally in the market. Can you just explain that a little bit better so that it just makes more sense and is clear?
Sure. Typically, NOAA's or natural occurring affordable housing is affordable housing that largely we point to our rent stabilization ordinance and our rent stabilized housing. And so when you have rents that are low and folks that are moderate and low income can naturally afford it because the price is lower, largely because it's a rent stabilized building, you know, that's naturally occurring affordable housing. Also, the longer someone is housed, the more likely they have a lower rent and have maintained a lower rent over time. And so the goal of our preservation programs is to preserve, largely through our rent stabilization ordinance, that naturally occurring affordable housing.
Okay, so it is tied to rent stabilization in the context of West Hollywood.
Yes.
Okay, got it.
Okay, are there any other questions? Okay, seeing none at this time. Next up.
Okay, thank you so much. So now we'll dive into goals, objectives, policies, and programs. And, you know, these really are expanding upon each other. And I like to think of them as getting more and more detailed as we go down the line, with goals being a general expression of community values and directions, really expressed as an end, not actions. And that's something that the state's guidance really calls for in terms of it being expressed as an end. Then we have objectives that are the steps towards attaining those goals, followed by policies, where a specific statement that guides decision-making and helps implement a vision is laid out, followed by implementation programs. And this is really the specific actions that are assigned to a responsible agency. Generally, some of our expanded implementation is for city staff to help us accomplish those objectives. And then we have quantified objectives, which Veronica Tam will jump in on a little bit more a little later, which include a specific end condition or state that is a measurable, immediate step towards implementing a program. And so the state really wants us to have quantified objectives for our programs so that we can help evaluate them. And so our goals and policies, these are the 6 housing goals that are outlined as part of the housing element update. And just to dive into each of them, I'll go through each goal with the intent and then the following objectives. And policy is. So goal H1, provide affordable housing. pretty simple, with the intent to protect the existing supply of affordable housing, as well as expanding upon affordable housing opportunities. And this can be done by addressing the effects of the vacancy decontrol regulations, Costa-Hawkins, on rent stabilized housing stock through local measures and legislative efforts. It calls for retaining and maintaining existing affordable housing, including that naturally occurring affordable housing, working to prevent or minimize displacement of existing residents, encouraging the replacement of multifamily housing that's demoed with housing that's affordable to a wide spectrum of households, maintaining a condo conversion ordinance, and identifying and addressing any unknown factors and forces, including zoning policies that adversely affect affordability. And this is really something that we want to work towards moving forward, is identifying those factors that we can address to help eliminate some of the barriers to constructing and having affordable housing within the city. The next goal is to maintain and enhance the quality of housing stock in residential neighborhoods, with the intent to maintain and enhance the quality and integrity of existing residential neighborhoods through programs and incentives to assist in rehab efforts. And so the 4 ways that we that we have outlined that are to assist landlords and other property owners in maintaining and improving their properties through a city's residential rehab programs, state programs, and other innovative mechanisms, promoting strong on-site management of residential buildings, encouraging development standards that support housing and mixed-use developments while protecting quality of life, while being mindful of social inclusion and sustainability goals, and continuing to support healthy neighborhoods by addressing public health and safety issues in cooperation with other agencies. And that includes ongoing property inspections. Excuse me. Goal 3 is to encourage a diverse housing stock to address the needs of all socioeconomic segments of the community. The intent here is to provide adequate housing to meet the diverse needs of the community, with due consideration for households with special needs. So there are a number of ways that we've outlined policies to do that, including facilitating the development of a diverse range of housing options, with the long list included here. And truly that is a key for the city to diversify and to ensure that we're building a wide range of housing for the diverse needs of our community. Supporting the development of affordable housing by nonprofits through financial assistance and other regulatory incentives. Continue to implement the inclusionary housing ordinance to make sure that we have affordability on on new projects. Promoting universal design for new construction and rehab of existing housing. Facilitate the development of housing with on-site supportive services, and encouraging the development of mixed income and housing that includes a variety of household compositions, like I said, to accommodate a range of ages and family types throughout the community. Goal 4 is to provide for adequate opportunities for new construction of housing, with the intent to provide adequate housing sites through appropriate land use and zoning designations to accommodate the city's diverse housing needs. And for this goal, we would encourage and provide incentives for the development of housing and mixed use and transit-oriented developments that really will help us close the gap by building housing near transit. Providing adequate sites to meet our needs, again, for that wide range of demographics, including special groups, older adults, persons with disabilities, people experiencing homelessness, veterans, single parents, large households, et cetera. Fostering adaptive reuse of existing structures, and then also prioritizing water and sewer services for affordable housing in the event that there's allocation of services required. Right now we have enough for all of the development in our city, but we want to make sure that that's always prioritized for our affordable housing projects. Goal H5 is to provide for a government environment that facilitates housing development and preservation, with the intent to mitigate potential government constraints to housing development, preservation, and affordability. And the way to do this would be to provide incentives where feasible to reduce costs of affordable housing, whether that be through density bonuses or flexibility in site development standards. We want to review fees and regulations to ensure that they're not unduly constraining housing development. This is really something that we plan to do fairly soon after the adoption of this housing element update, is really do a full analysis of our existing regulations to make sure that we can remove any constraints or at least come up with solutions to address them. We also would consider planning and development fee reductions, again, to help meet the high cost of housing, providing for coordinated processing of the development projects, again, to reduce the costs that's associated with the development review process, and then streamlining the permitting process for certain types of projects as we have done in the past. For the next goal, it's affirmatively furthering fair housing for all. And we'll delve into this item a little bit further in talking about programs, but I did actually want to turn this over to Veronica Tam really quickly to kind of walk through affirmatively furthering fair housing.
Thank you, Rachel. Yeah, I just want to kind of go over the AFFH affirmatively furthering fair housing is a new requirement for the housing element law, AB 686 that was passed in 2017, requires that the housing element looks at housing production and services in a lens of affirmatively furthering fair housing. So you see that the Appendix C in the housing element really looks at some of the existing conditions in the categories of segregation and concentration of poverty, racial and ethnic concentration, displacement risks, and also disproportionate needs. So those are some of the existing conditions that we have to evaluate in the city of West Hollywood. And then what we also have to do in the AFFH analysis is to look at your sites for your regional housing needs allocation when you're deciding where to place your future growth, whether you are distributing the sites throughout the city and that you're not over concentrating those new housing in areas, particularly housing that's feasible for lower income, to be in areas that has limited resources and opportunities. So, and if you do have to do that for certain reasons or for sometimes for good reasons, do you have programs and policies put in place to also make sure that these neighborhoods are being improved with amenities? So kind of coupled with the analysis, we have programs in the housing element that addresses affirmatively furthering fair housing. And I have to say, like, City of West Hollywood is one of the few cities that actually have a lot of those in place already, like your tenants protection, your rent stabilization. You have, you also have good, enforcement of fair housing. And so some of these actions are incorporated in the housing element. There are some additional programs that we talked about. We recommended in the housing element as well. So.
Thanks, Veronica. And just to kind of walk through this goal with the intent to promote equal opportunity for all residents, this includes the policies listed below, and we'll talk a little bit about the programs associated in just a moment. And so, at this point, we've gone through those goals and objectives. Thank you for listening to that. It is a lot to soak in. And I think once you hear the programs associated with it, it helps to tie it all into place. But at this point, we wanted to check in and ask, is this a strong vision for housing preservation, production, and innovation reflected in the goals and objectives? What goals and objectives may need an update or to be added? And I know we've discussed this in the past, so we have heard from a lot of you, but we wanted to check in on this final draft or this draft and see where you're at as a commission. So I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Okay, let's open this to questions. And I'd also like to throw in there that at this point, I would like to hear what the task force comments were as regards these goals.
Sure. Why don't we just skip to that really quickly? Giving up the whole presentation. So task force comments. They, one of the things that we heard from the task force at their meeting last Monday was that they wanted to make the goals more specific and actionable. Generally, the goals are left to be very, 10,000 feet, but they wanted to break down the goals and particularly goal H1 to include levels of affordable housing, and specifically to reference discouraging displacement for goal H1. And so those were their key comments specifically related to the goals. They got into it a little bit more about the housing programs themselves.
Thank you. There's quite a bit here, and it is the heart of, I think, what we're discussing, this entire housing element. So at this time, I would like to open the floor to questions, conversation regarding these goals. Vice Chair Jones.
Thank you. I actually have a number of comments that I think I may end up saving until the end, that I think is just overall feedback. But I did want to kind of toggle back to Commissioner Dutta's question and comment about the naturally occurring. Is there a reason in that the goal under H1, I believe it's goal H1 number 2, this is on PDF page 4, and it also looks like it's on page 4 of the actual document. Is there a reason we wouldn't just remove this second part of this sentence that's including affordable housing that exists naturally in the market? I guess I just think if it's just retaining and maintaining existing affordable housing, why do we need the second part of it? I just think one of the pieces of feedback that we've received, and I think many of us on the commission are in agreement with, has been about the fact that we want this document to be something that we feel doesn't mislead the public and does as good a job as possible of being transparent about what is and isn't possible and what we actually hope to accomplish vis-a-vis like what kinds of goals are set out for us, e.g. RHNA numbers. And I'm not talking about RHNA numbers in this comment, but it sounds like there's an existing, term or terminology that's used for naturally occurring affordable housing, and that's fine. But if I'm just someone reading this, I just think that it sounds a little weird. But if there's a reason that it needs to be in there, I'm all ears.
Yeah, I think one thing I wanted to add to my explanation of NOAA is about subsidy, right? So any sort of subsidized that is coming from the city, the state, the federal, government. So naturally occurring affordable housing doesn't have subsidy from, it's just without a government intervention. And so I think that why number 2 is phrased, H1-2 is phrased that way, is we're saying affordable housing typically has a subsidy on it from whether that be tax credit financing or loans from the city. Whereas, comma, and then the next section is saying including, naturally occurring affordable housing that doesn't really have government intervention. And we can piece apart whether or not a rent stabilization ordinance is in fact a constraint, but in a different market, that's just kind of the term. And I completely hear you. I think we could strike it, and we could look at kind of the other ways that we're talking about protecting our rent stabilized housing stock, because in West Hollywood, because our aging housing stock is almost completely rent stabilized, they're one and the same. But in a community that doesn't have such a strong rent stabilization ordinance, they could be, separate groups. But in ours, they're the same. But I think potentially that we could strike that and instead focus on our housing stock. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. That makes perfect sense, Allison. I think something that I think we get tripped up on, and that everyone gets tripped up on, and I don't mean to say that it's because of any kind of ignorance, but there is a pretty distinct difference in West Hollywood specifically between affordable housing that is subsidized and rent stabilized housing. And rent stabilized housing can be affordable, but I don't know that I want to conflate the two in a document that is this important. So maybe there's another way of wording it. I will stew on that a bit, but that's just for now my feedback about it.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing, Commissioner, that maybe that could be clarified by saying something about subsidized affordable housing and unsubsidized affordable rent-controlled housing or something like that. Because I think it is important that we note that we have affordable housing that occurs over time, and we do want to try to protect that as best we can. We can't protect it completely because it's not subsidized, but it's something we want to acknowledge.
I think
great.
If I would throw in here, if this were a quote unquote legal document, affordable housing would be a defined term, it would be in caps, and it would be those things that are on the list of, affordable housing that has, been, marked and is on Allison's list, as opposed to rent stabilized units. And I think it's important that we speak to the rent stabilized units and or things that are just affordable because the goal is provide affordable housing. There's sort of at least 2, maybe 3 categories of that, and they might require different sections. I don't know. Did you have additional items, Commissioner Jones?
Not at this time.
Does anyone else have anything regarding all of these goals? Commissioner Dutta.
Thanks. So kind of reading through the goals and then comparing each of the, I guess, subheadings under the goals for each of them, and kind of comparing them to the different documents and attachments that we did receive. A lot of them have, or a lot of them go into more detail and kind of, just talk more about what the strategies actually are and give background. But then there's a few that I, at least after having looked through all the documents that we received, didn't see some real background or kind of explanation for. And so I guess I would stress that everything here, hopefully there's something that's included in one of the technical documents that at least gives a better indication of what it is the city strategy actually is. I'll give a couple of examples. So goal H2, number 2, promoting strong on-site management of apartment complexes. So I didn't necessarily see anything that describes what that actual strategy is or what the city actually does to promote that in any of the documents. So that was one thing that, because obviously as a longtime renter, I agree with, strong on-site management makes a huge difference in how well properties are maintained over time. And so that's one thing I noticed. And then the other one would be promotion of universal design, which is H3, number 4, in construction of new housing and rehabilitation. So if we can make sure that everything is addressed, so that way it's not just a line item that gets copied from housing element to housing element, but actually there's an actual strategy there that's actually described and detailed out. So those are the 2. And if I missed them, please let me know, because there was a lot of documents here to go through and a lot of pages to flip through. So if I missed anything, certainly let me know. But those are my observations, and there's probably some more included in there as well.
Yeah, Commissioner Dutta, I would say that the program that is aligned to your first comment is then program 28, the enhanced management program. And that ties to our affordable buildings. And then the other programs that are tied are just enforcing the rent stabilization ordinance. And so there's a number of items within the RSO that ties to how often you get new, how your building is managed in the sense of the amenities within your rent stabilized unit. So I think those are the 2 areas, whether it be affordable or rent stabilized. In our general market rate buildings that aren't yet part of the RSO, it's difficult to have any sort of management enforcement there. And then on the universal design part, I think it's somewhat of a tied into kind of our urban design studio, and we can kind of tease out where we include that. But within the programs, there's several of them discussing kind of the design context of what we're looking for in housing. But we can do a better job of looking how that's teased through.
Thank you. I would chip in. I did have a note on that one myself, Commissioner Dutta, that I was having a question around, how does universal design promote diversity of housing stock? That just seems antithetical to me. Universality of design implies a commonality of design, which is not diversity. So that one was a head scratcher for me. Commissioner Caballero, you had questions.
Yeah, thank you. Just building on what Commissioner Dutta mentioned, because I have three, one from H1, H2, and H5, goal H1, H2, and H5, and one, and I thought I heard Rachel say that I think we're going to identify these items once the report is adopted, but I'm particularly interested in what these development incentives that we might identify, or what kind of flexibility we're going to be having with our zoning. And then what constraints do we currently have that we might address to make development easier? And then the fourth one kind of relates to the previous section in regards to the age of our buildings. Yes, 30 years is not really old, but it's old enough that buildings need sizable improvement at that point. And what kind of incentives are we potentially considering to help maintain those buildings? So is the easy answer just this will all be identified once the report is adopted and we really start digging into these things? Or did I miss that information somewhere in the documents that you sent us?
So I think, just to answer that last question, a lot of the programs that we have are helping to further these policies and objectives, and some are exploratory in nature and talk about looking at incentives and looking at a variety of ways to break down barriers, and we don't necessarily have the answers yet. You'll find similar kind of language in conversations about upzoning, where we're not specifying the exact change in zoning to occur. We don't need it for capacity for our sites analysis, but we do want to look at increasing our capacity in a variety of residential districts. And we haven't specified what that is yet, but we know that we want to explore those types of programs. So those are for the programs that are already established. You'll see a lot of that type of exploratory language.
So Rachel, will we be informed as this unrolls in the future?
Absolutely. So most of these would result in changes to the zoning ordinance. So they would come to Planning Commission for recommendation to City Council, and in order to get your opinion on those potential regulations. And so this is always something that's going to come back to Planning Commission, and especially changes that, for example, change the development review threshold, that where projects come before Planning Commission. Those are also things that require changes to the zoning ordinance. So we'd be coming to Planning Commission for your recommendation on those changes.
Right, but then I guess your question in the previous slide is this a robust or big enough sort of blanket? I definitely, it's hitting all the points that I'm interested in, and I'm looking forward to seeing how we, ferret out some of these items in real life. Thank you.
I just wanted to address the universal design. Maybe Commissioner Caballero also can explain a little bit about that. But universal design is trying to make sure the buildings are accessible. So it's an accessibility issue of universal design. It's not trying to make all the buildings look alike or be the same. It's about accessibility in the buildings for the people going to the bathroom and using the facility.
Thank you. Other questions? Right. Well,
just one quick question.
Sure.
I think perhaps expanding upon what Commissioner Caballero just flagged as well. Looking at goal H1 6, identify and address any unknown factors and forces, including zoning policies that may adversely affect affordability. So I'm just wondering, in the technical document, are there specific areas we should be looking at that already start to kind of touch upon this?
Yeah, so we do lay out in that technical document, in the constraints to housing, we generally speak about some of the regulatory factors that can limit affordability, as well as just the construction of housing overall. And those range from the development review process to the actual development standards that are placed on each site. So really looking at that kind of in a two-pronged approach of process, and then just kind of the rules of each site, of what you can and can't build, and helping to lift some of those constraints to construction. And again, to change the process as well to help usher these types of projects that include housing through the process itself.
Okay, I think maybe to kind of go back to the idea of actionable items, perhaps there could be a way to sort of identify and or scope out some potential ways that some of that could specifically be addressed with the data that's made available.
And I think just to clarify, so that is in the program section. So right now we're talking about the policies and the goals.
Okay.
So that's like the H1. It's your item. It's your 11-6, 7, 8. Sorry, and then we start getting into the programs on 11-7. And that's when you start going into, well, what are the planning goals for the next 8 years in terms of actionable items? What's going to be, things that are going to be coming to Planning Commission that we're going to be looking at. And so most of those that we're discussing right now in terms of the 2 comments we've just had are in program number 11 about production of housing. And so then if you go down to time frame and objectives, it says, what we're going to do by 2022. And, consider expanding the mixed incentive overlay in 2022. We're looking at specific items. And so just for our discussion tonight, we do want to spend a lot of time on the programs. We just want to get there after we talk about goals and policies right now. So that's just kind of, we should have made that more clear as we were starting off, kind of how the housing element is broken down.
Okay, and on that note, I'll reserve my questions for later in the discussion.
Great, thank you.
And also I'd like to say, we identify these things that we need to look at, but as the city goes through that review process, we may wind up having to make a determination, balancing various things of balancing affordability issues with the ability for the public to review a project, with the requirements of trying to make buildings livable for the people in the buildings. So there's a lot of things that while we say we're wanting to look at affordability, we also are having to look at other aspects as well. And so that's always a balancing act in all of this.
Okay, are there any other questions? Then I will make my notes. I would agree with the task force. That's my notes on this is be more specific and actionable. I mean, I think Rachel, in your outline, you said these goals are an end. It is a goal, and that is what a goal is, an end. And so I feel like a lot of these use very obtuse language in the sense it's sort of generic to facilitate or something. It's not really an end, a true objective. So I think that could be tighter because let's remember, these are the things that get pulled out and put into the findings of the staff reports that are presented to us and say, hey, look, this meets a goal. And so I would take this up to the 10,000 foot level. And I think this is something I brought up at the last meeting, which is how are these goals different than the goals from 8 years ago? And how are the changes that have been made going to result in different results? So I think one of the conversations is the fact that in our general plan process, one of the reasons that we upzoned all along the main corridors was to push the large developments to the main corridors. And that was one of our goals as a city, is to not create additional density in the existing residential neighborhoods, but move it to the main corridors. The result of the past 8 years is that really hasn't happened a great deal. There's been some on the east side, but not to the extent that was planned. And what has happened is because the R3 and R4 zones were cheaper, that's where developers have bought, and that's where the development has happened. And that really wasn't one of our goals. We stated at the time, no, we really wanted the development to happen along the main corridors, and that's where the transportation corridors were, et cetera. So my question is, it's attributed to Albert Einstein, but the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. Are we doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result? And that's kind of a really, more than 10,000 foot level question here, but do these goals get us to what we keep saying we want, which is the development to happen along the corridors? And there's lots of pieces here, but I think that would be my overarching conversation on this whole thing. And that's back to being more specific and actionable and tightening these up quite a bit. I think without getting completely into the weeds, I think that's the main comments that I would have on the goals as they stand. Okay. If there's no other questions on this section, Rachel?
Thank you, Lynn. I do want to respond to one of your comments about, are we doing the same thing and expecting different results? I mean, frankly, we are one of 20 cities in the state of California that met our RENA allocation for this current cycle. And we're considered a leader in the affordable housing field throughout the state. So there is a large portion of our plan to continue doing what we're doing, but then also build upon that. So we were really clear about that from the beginning, that we did want to build upon our very successful, set of policies and programs that we have today, and build upon that to further expand and further reach our goals.
I absolutely understand. And I don't think anyone would disagree that we have, we've done, what we only exceeded our original RENA goals the last time around by 1,000%. I mean, I get it. We built a lot of stuff. The question is, as a city, is it the kind of building that we wanted, where we wanted? Did it provide the maximum amount of benefit to our citizens? For example, in terms of affordability, the vast majority of what was built was market rate and very high market rate. And so the question is, yes, yay, we built a lot of stuff. Did we do it the best way we could do it for our community?
Okay, well, here's where we'll delve into the programs, I think, that get at the heart of, achieving some of these goals and policies and objectives. And they're really broken into 5 categories: preservation of existing housing, preservation of affordability, production of housing, removal of government constraints, as well as affirmatively furthering fair housing, where I'll turn it over to Veronica Tam once again. And actually, I would like to turn it over to Veronica to discuss quantified objectives and this summary.
When it comes to the housing element, at the end of it, after we looked at all the programs, and you'll be looking at the programs later on, but the programs comes back to what each city calls like quantify objectives. You have to have, just like you mentioned, you have to have a measurable way to evaluate whether you've met your goals, whether you've met your intended results. But what we have to do in the housing element, there are 3 different types of quantified objectives that we have to establish. One is units to be constructed, and 2, units to be rehabilitated, and 3, units to be preserved. Now, units to be constructed, you have your RENA. And this is like right now, this is really just actually just looking at it, and hopefully, with some discussions, we can establish the quantified objectives better. You have your regional housing needs allocation. RENA is considered a minimum, not a maximum. You must accommodate at least that many units. But when it comes to actual production, the state also recognizes that affordable housing is extremely expensive to build. And so when you're establishing the quantified objectives, the state says, well, look at what is reasonable within your resources. that you think you can achieve. Even though your RENA may be a certain number, 3341, I believe, but you may not be able to actually achieve that. Because particularly for the lower and moderate income household, extremely low income, definitely. And so what would you like to do? Some cities would automatically say, oh, just put the RENA there. But what I think what we should be doing is looking at your resources, looking at your programs, what would be a reasonable number? What would you like to achieve? What kind of reason, like how would you invest your limited resources in terms of putting it in the extremely low, putting it in the low, or do you want to spread it in among the very low, low and moderate income? Above moderate income is basically the market. The market will take care of itself. More than likely, you'll get more than 1,000 units in terms of market. But in terms of the low and moderate income, what would be the appropriate distribution, and what do we want to achieve based on the programs that we have? Units to be rehabilitated. This is the difficult part right now. We don't have a quantified objectives yet here, and part of the reason is because we wanted to get the input from the different commissions. Currently, because of the elimination of redevelopment, and because you're only participating through CDBG programs through the county, you have very limited resources for rehab assistance. And certainly not enough funding for rental rehab, definitely not a lot for owner rehab either. There's not a whole lot of funding. The only program that you have is through the nonprofit. I think it does about 15 households a year. So then in looking at the programs later in the housing program section, and that's like the direction that we're looking at, like, do you want to invest resources? Do you want to generate revenue so that you can put it into providing rehabilitation assistance or facilitate rehabilitation in your community? Units to be conserved are the affordable units that may be at risk of converting to market rate housing. And earlier there was a question why there's a drop in the number. That's because it's very difficult to preserve certain units that are converting to market rate. The city, did lose a couple of projects. I believe one was a mortgage revenue bond project that no longer are considered deed restricted. They may continue to be affordable because there is Section 8 on it, but they're no longer deed restricted permanent, like long-term affordable housing. So you have quite a bit of them that are going to be, well, actually you don't have any major projects. I think there may be just one project that may be considered at risk of converting to market rate, but that one project is owned by the county housing authority. So in reality, there's not anything that is considered at risk, but circumstance may change. We don't know that, and like owner's intent of property may change hands. So what we wanted to do in here is to at least try to monitor all these affordable housing projects. If conditions change and somebody actually try to opt out of affordable housing, there is some strategies in place to protect your tenants or help them through transitioning to some other kind of assistance. So those are the three areas of quantified objectives, but we're really looking for your direction as to what would be the appropriate resource allocation.
Thanks, Veronica. So just to walk through those housing programs that help us reach that quantifiable objective, regarding preservation of existing housing, we have, our retrofitting of existing housing program. We also have incentives for rehabilitation that we have existing and to develop. We have a program for small multifamily building acquisition and rehabilitation. We have the Home Secure program, which helps provide financing, historic preservation for existing buildings, as well as code compliance to ensure that buildings are being maintained. Regarding, and I'm really just touching upon these, we do have so many programs. We really have a robust housing program to begin with today that we're, again, like I said, building upon. So if you want to delve in further, obviously feel free to jump in and we can discuss these in more detail at the break. So for preservation of affordability, obviously the pinnacle of our program is our rent stabilization ordinance that provides that affordability level for a vast number of our units within the city. We also have housing choice vouchers and preservation of publicly assisted housing with help through our partners. And we also have a residential referral list that helps to place people in our new affordable housing as well as when units become available. Regarding the production of housing, this is where we have a number of programs today as well as some new programs to provide. Obviously, our adequate sites to meet our RHNA outlines the capacity that we have today to accommodate our RHNA allocation and really looking for monitoring of no net loss of units. Which is something that we have on the books today and is required by state law to make sure that we don't lose any units through redevelopment. We also are looking at requiring more replacement housing when affordable units or rent-controlled units are being redeveloped. We've also changed our regulations regarding accessory dwelling units, but looking at ways to further incentivize accessory dwelling units. We do have an inclusionary housing ordinance on the books today that I have mentioned, but looking at ways to expand upon that program always. The inclusionary housing ordinance requires that a vast majority of projects are providing about 20% of affordable units of the base requirement, and that also provides a pretty substantial density bonus. We're looking at ways to expand upon that so that we can expand on the amount of affordable housing each project is potentially providing on site, as well as furthering some incentives to get more affordable and different types of affordable housing. So this is also where we're looking at creating new affordable housing with partnerships with nonprofits. We already do this today. We're looking at expanding our partnerships with other community partners as well. And then something that we haven't done in the past, but that we're actively working on now and hope to have, really on the ground running in the next few years is a community land trust. So right now we're looking for partners to engage in that process and program with the city right now. Additionally, related to production of housing, we're really looking to expand on programs that can help us with workforce housing, the missing middle, family housing, and ownership housing opportunities. There is the home ownership program that helps to encourage home ownership and provide financing, as well as the mortgage credit certificates and the first home mortgage program. But again, as we look at our inclusionary regulations, there's really an opportunity to also provide more programs that can help us incentivize workforce housing and that missing middle by creating potentially a new tier of affordability in the city. We also have our commercial development impact fee that gets used for the production of housing within the city. And then we also have our green building program, which again, I think it plays into and is an essential for the production of housing to be environmentally sustainable, to improve our resiliency and also have a product on the ground that people want to live in. Also, removal of government constraints as a category for programs. This is a really big one that we spoke about a little bit earlier. We obviously have those kind of two-pronged issues here. We have the process for review of development projects, and then we also have our development standards themselves. So really looking at those two categories to see how we can reduce barriers through the development review process, reducing the amount of time it takes for projects to go through our process, but also without reducing the quality of that review, but also providing some certainty to developers as well helps reduce the costs of doing business with the city. And then again, looking at all of our residential development standards to see how we can further incentivize the construction of housing and also remove some of the constraints that make housing projects difficult to actually come to fruition. There's also a number of zoning ordinance amendments that will need to occur in order for us to completely comply with some recent changes to state law. We've done some changes, but haven't completely become compliant with AB 101, AB 139, SB 2, AB 2162, and then AB 2345. We've made some changes regarding density bonus, but we'll need to continue to make changes to our zoning ordinance. So all of those are going to help us comply with state law, but again, are also going to help remove some of the constraints that exist today in order to help construct low barrier navigation centers, emergency and transitional housing, and supportive housing, as well as just all housing that includes affordable housing on site. As I said, looking at streamlining the development review process, and then really looking at our fees and waivers that we have for affordable housing to, again, reduce the barriers to entry to be able to construct new affordable housing within the city. And then as far as our programs regarding affirmatively furthering fair housing, I do want to turn it back over to Veronica where she can walk through these. Thank you.
Thank you. As I mentioned before, the affirmatively furthering fair housing really is looking at not only just fair housing counseling that most of the time people are used to hearing, but looking at housing element, housing policies and programs, especially also in the housing production, how you're going to provide equal access to opportunities. So all the requirements, we're looking at housing in affirmatively furthering housing in several lenses. One, outreach and enforcement, that's definitely important. One thing that the city does that is a little bit above and beyond most other jurisdictions is you do go after sometimes landlords that are not complying with fair housing laws. In other jurisdictions, they most likely rely on a fair housing service providers to just provide counseling. You do have access to fair housing services through the LA County Housing Rights Center is your is the service provider, but the city does do more than that. One thing that we talked about in the housing element is also the fact that because of your rent stabilization and because the city is a high proportion of renters, you have a lot of renter protection kind of programs, including tenant landlord mediation and tenant eviction protections. Those are something that other jurisdictions may not already have, but you already have that in place. The other things related to affirmatively furthering fair housing is supportive services for the special needs population, because you do want to make sure that housing, particularly for a lot of special needs groups, they need more than just the actual housing. They need the supportive services to go with the housing. And that's something that the city of West Hollywood does provide as well. And we want to make sure that you continue to do that and probably even expanding it to different type of special needs groups. Enhanced management, that is definitely something that you do through a nonprofit in order to make sure that some of the affordable housing projects are managed properly and that they're done in a way that is furthering fair housing. One thing that's actually very interesting too, you would wonder why there's a business assistance and relocation support in the housing element, and mainly because if you look at a lot of the sites that we are talking about in the new housing, they're all in the commercial corridors, in your mixed use overlays, in all these high density areas. We're really talking about redevelopment some of the commercial uses that are maybe old or underutilized into mixed use or residential uses. In doing that, though, you also want to make sure that you're helping your existing businesses, that you're stabilizing some of your existing business community. And so you do have a business assistance and relocation support program. That's important, I think, that to go along with your strategies for meeting your regional housing needs allocation, and continue to be engaging in your community. That's definitely an affirmatively furthering fair housing goal, that you make sure that the people who are most disproportionately impacted would have a voice in the whole strategies for providing housing or resources, the allocation of housing resources in the community. And lastly, relating to the housing related urban programming, like that is another aspect of almost looking at fair housing from an environmental justice perspective. How do you improve the neighborhood conditions? How do you improve the quality of the neighborhoods, providing wellness and walkability in some of the neighborhoods? So all these kind of put together, it's what you have right now for affirmatively furthering fair housing. But if you have other ideas that would increase, enhance tenant protection, and certainly enhance affordability, and all that would be welcome too. With that, I turn it back to Rachel.
Thanks, Veronica. So that was quite a bit of information again. And, I think that really, between everything that we covered, is really the crux of what the housing element itself really includes. And so we really wanted to give you those key overviews. I know there's a lot more detail. We obviously can delve in quite deeply, but we really wanted to touch upon the programs that we discussed, as well as anything previously that you want to talk about. Was there anything missing? Do you have any other general comments? Are there any programs you want to delve in or discuss further, or any specific programs that you didn't see that you'd like to see in the housing element itself? So I'll turn it over to the commissioners. Thank you so much.
Commissioner Caballero.
Rachel, I was excited to read in the ADU section that the city is considering forgivable loans if you build out ADU for low-income housing. Was any thought given to how much those loans would be, how long the unit would be available, like what kind of terms went into that? I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, so I can handle that. So this item actually went forward to the council in May at the May meeting. It was approved by the council to launch hiring a consultant to do this. The original thought is the underwriting we've done initially is there are $150,000 loans that will be forgivable over 10 years. That's our current kind of just ballparking. Part of the RFP process is to build that out. We've already done interviews with homeowners to see if there's a market for that. And our goal with the pilot, based on the approved funds from council, is 3 affordable units to start. So again, that's coming. We're hoping to get the RFP out in the fall, and then be talking to homeowners and building out the program in 2022. But we're giving ourselves, if you look at the housing element program, we're giving ourselves a year plus to really start construction and really get that program off the ground.
That's great. That was really interesting. Thank you.
Vice Chair Jones.
I have a request. I actually have a ton of comments about the last section, and I know there was a lot there. Can we take a quick break?
I am
just like
amenable
2 minutes.
Let's call it 8 o'clock and let's reconvene at 8:05.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Hi, David. Do we have all the peoples?
Hello, Chair. Yes, if we can get all our commissioners back online, please. And it looks like we're just waiting for Commissioner Carvalero, and then we'll be ready to go for your chair.
Thank you, David. Here we go. We have our quorum. Welcome back, everyone. We will reconvene this previously intermitted meeting of the special meeting of July 29th. It is 8:06 p.m. and we will resume with commissioner comments and questions. I think we left off with, I forget who we left off with. I think Commissioner Jones, you were ready to share your list.
Sure, yeah, and I'm happy to go. And I think most of my feedback will come from this section. Just to be clear, Rachel, does that conclude staff's presentation for now? Is that everything? Like we walked through everything now?
The rest of it is really just talking about next steps. So that's the bulk of the presentation.
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you. So the first thing I wanted to chat through was, let's see, it is item 20, which I believe is on, let me organize my windows here. I think it's on page 21. Just scrolling down. I did not print this out, so I'm working off of these PDFs and toggling between that and my notes. So under section,
Stacy, to be clear, are we in the technical background report or?
No, we're in the actual housing element document.
Got it.
This is page 21 in the PDF, item 20. It's under removal of governmental constraints, residential development standards and process. I just had a couple of notes that I wanted to incorporate that I wanted to provide feedback on here. So number 2, the objective design standards. Again, this is something that I want to be clear about in terms of the public. Just thinking about actual objective design standards as opposed to, I think people probably normally think of design as being something that's fairly subjective. Maybe this belongs here, maybe it doesn't, it just caught my eye and I wanted to say that. The third item here, the third bullet, replace second floor setback requirements with incentives for climate action achievement. I don't know that I think it needs to, that these two things need to be put together. I think I understand why they are, but I don't know that I think that one needs to replace the other. I don't know that I think that second floor setback requirements need to be replaced with incentives for climate action achievement. I don't even, go ahead, Lynn.
That ties, I believe, to an existing green building, and since the green building's going away, is that why that's here?
We'll continue to have a green building requirements, but we wanted to be able to alleviate that second floor step back, but also incentivize green buildings. So thought it could be a match. We can certainly look at separating those.
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering if that needs to be in the housing element. It does also sound like we need to toe kind of a balance between overall goals and objectives and kind of practical application of those with things that might be much more granular and determined by policy within the next 8 years, but that jumped out at me. I also wanted to note, and again, I want to be mindful of time here, but I'm just thinking about, this allow individual metering for water and energy consumption. I completely understand why anyone would want to do this, and this is purely anecdotal, but I know that I am someone who has worked 100% from home for the past 18 months. I keep getting these emails from like SoCal Gas and Edison about, my energy consumption. And I'm like, hey guys, like I'm home all the time. Like this is my office, this is my gym. So I'm just wondering, I'm not necessarily against individual metering, but I just think if we take into account kind of the changing nature of people's relationships with their homes and the activities that they're going to carry on there, and so many more companies doing remote first or, you know, hybridized kind of situations where it's like a 3-2 and you're in the office some days and not others. Can we maybe think about changing the wording of this to like promote awareness of individual use, you know, by encouraging individual metering and sub-metering or something? I just don't, I know that we're not requiring it, but I just wanted to, I wanted to be thoughtful about the way that we are kind of putting that forward there. As regards, there's also, so the last one of these here is revised threshold for planning commission review to reduce time, delay, and uncertainty for housing development projects. I feel like this might be oversimplification of a pretty layered issue. You know, I think it's fair to say that like we're happy to serve, and I'm very grateful to be a planning commissioner in the city of West Hollywood and to be able to provide this feedback. But you know, we also have a lot of meetings this month, and to that extent, I think it's not that there is no like power flex here or anything. I just think that this might be, again, an oversimplification of kind of a couple of different factors. I think one, if I may, it seems like we have applications coming in that come from kind of a wide variety of experience levels in terms of submitting to the city, so that there are things that staff might be getting that aren't like ready for showtime, so to speak, and so take more review time. I think, you know, staff is already so saddled with, I think, the number of projects. I was kind of given, you know, a heads up about this by another commissioner when I came on to planning 6 years ago, but just that, you know, following the Great Recession, that there was going to be a lot of activity, both residentially and commercially in the city of West Hollywood. I think that's definitely proven to be true. So I'm just, you know, I don't know that I think revising the threshold for planning commission review is necessarily the answer here. And I think the thresholds that we have in place, I personally feel very comfortable with, and I'd love to hear the rest of the commission's feedback about that. But I, you know, to say that it's, you know, planning commission review is what holds things up, like, yes, that is a part of the process, but I also never want the public to feel as though they are losing opportunities to hear projects and to be a part of that public feedback process. For many of whom, it may be the only time that they get to come and comment at all. So, you know, I did want to message that, or to flag that. You know, one of the things that I think, you know, might be helpful, and, you know, I'm not intimately involved with the day-to-day workings of what happens with, you know, our planning department right now, but is there a kind of like, I don't know, like a pre-application meeting or something, or some kind of initial vetting or opportunity for an applicant to come in and meet with staff to kind of go through like what the minimum requirements will be? Again, I don't know what the situation is right now, but that was something that I thought might be helpful in order to help kind of reduce that bottleneck, which I know that all of, like, everyone on this call and everyone on staff has, you know, I imagine more work than maybe is manageable right now. So, you know, I want to give credit to staff, but also think about ways that we can help to lighten the load a bit from the get-go.
I can jump in real quick on that last question you brought up, and the answer is yes. We have pre-application meetings all the time with applicants. The vast majority of individuals' projects are through pre-applications, and now with the Housing Accountability Act, there's an additional kind of official pre-application meeting for projects that are wanting to go through the Housing Accountability Act, where we have to give them information before they apply. So all of that is taking place. Some of the streamlining is in reaction to, you know, the changes in state law. For example, like the Housing Accountability Act, I can't say that, has taken away some of the planning commission in the city's ability to act and modify buildings. And so one thing, and it's not necessarily streamlining it, but I think we should look at how are those projects processed, because also we want to make sure the public understands that there's a different set of rules that are being applied to those projects than, let's say, a building that has housing but isn't subject to the Housing Accountability Act. And so whether it's streamlining or treating them different, but there's something to try to help make the public understand the limitations that the city has for certain projects based on state. So that's part of kind of the
Okay. That's helpful, John. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think just, making sure that applicants know like what's required, and but agreed that I imagine that the process can be unwieldy at times. I also wanted to ask at the bottom of page 21, this last sentence, that the city will evaluate its single family residential development standards to increase the number of homes in single family residential neighborhoods. Are we talking about ADUs there?
We're talking about the base density as well as ADUs. So we generally, most of our quote unquote single family residential districts allow more than one unit already, plus an ADU, plus a junior accessory dwelling unit. But we do want to look at opportunities to allow, particularly in areas where there's only one unit allowed, to add additional, one or two additional units on those sites. And not change necessarily the nature of the district, but to allow for more units to be built.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Rachel. I think just to toggle back to my last point about the process, and to John's point, if there's anything that staff thinks would help streamline the process, I mean, you are more privy to that than we would be as commissioners. So if there are specific things that you think could help do that, I think it might be helpful to incorporate them in a broad way here. And I think that's under item 22 on page 23. Just going down through my notes here. I have a few, but we just also did, it's like 20 pages of the report. So I want to make sure that I hit everything. John, there isn't, and Rachel, anybody can answer this, I suppose, but I want to make sure that would be no removal of, planning commission review when projects utilize the density bonus. There's no state law that has been signed as of yet where there would ever be an instance like that, correct?
There's no state law that would require us to eliminate that at this time, but that's certainly something that we're looking at, as well as changing that threshold. As you said, any project that's utilizing that density bonus ends up going to planning commission. And so this would allow for, potentially that to be eliminated. Again, we haven't said yes or no, but just looking at exploring all of the different ways to change our development review thresholds.
And I think that kind of what I was saying earlier about balancing, because this is a housing element. So it's telling us to try to figure out how we can handle housing. Then we have all sorts of other goals and policies and other portions of our general plan that we also want to balance. So this says, take a look at streamlining, let's say, but then we need to balance, we also in our governance policy talk about, making sure the public is involved in things. And so that's where this allows us to explore something, but it doesn't necessarily say we have to adopt it.
Got it. All right. I just want to say for the record that I would be vehemently against any project with that's utilizing a density bonus not being able to come before planning commission. I think, 9 times out of 10, maybe 10 times out of 10, these are often the projects that have, that solicit the most community feedback. And I think often that make projects bigger than they might be zoned to be per the code. So, maybe there are other, ways that we can talk through thresholds, like maybe anything that's over 3 stories should go to planning commission. And maybe thinking about mass more than about unit count, but I just, again, want to make sure that we're not eliminating opportunities for the public to be able to have input there. All I have some kind of overall, some other overall feedback. I also wanted to thank the, let me make sure I don't get her name wrong. The memo that was sent through Angie Brooks, I think wrote a really helpful memo that I think services some of the things that we've been talking about in our, discussions of the housing element. And, Commissioner Hoopengarner had mentioned before kind of, where do we want housing? And what kind of housing do we want? And, as I understand it, we got, rid of the mixed use overlay zone or incentive overlay zone in our last housing element. And, there have been more conversations about moving residential development to the boulevard so that we don't have as much of an impact on residential neighborhoods as they stand right now. So I think those are really important questions for us to ask, like adjusting residential zoning to incent more commercial and more mixed use, and like not needing to upzone unless like in terms of identified sites, like okay, I'm just going to stop talking on that point right now. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought, so I'm going to move on. I did want to echo the comments that Commissioner Caballero and I believe Commissioner Dutta, or maybe Lombardi, sorry, it's all bleeding into one now, about aging housing stock. I was looking at the number of units in the technical report, and it looks like almost 17% of them were built before 1939, which is, a huge number. So just thinking about, buildings that might be old, but that are not historic, that may not be designated, like the building that I used to live in at Sweetser and Romaine was built, I believe, in 1927. So we're coming up on a housing element period during which we're going to have the housing stock that is at its 100-year mark. And just thinking about how we're going to be looking at that, like incentives for rehabilitation. And I know that some of that's covered in the housing element document, again, for buildings that are old, but that are not designated as historic. Thinking about how, improvements can be made to electrical, to plumbing, how we can relocate people when those kinds of improvements need to be made, how we can, replace things and replace units and people when we need to, and how to conserve things, and maybe make some determinations for what is going to stay and what needs to be either updated or replaced. So I just want to be really, I'd like to be really thoughtful about that. Overall, I want to thank staff for all of your work on this. I know it's kind of overtaken 2021. I feel like, especially at planning commission meetings. I recognize that there's a lot coming down from the state that we have to comply with, which I think in some ways feels a little unfair by virtue of the fact that we've always been ahead of the curve, and a lot of the state laws are kind of one size fits all. And in some ways, I feel that we've been, for as progressive as we are, maybe unfairly kind of tagged or held to standards that we've always exceeded, and have, I think, probably helped forge policy that affected these state laws. But I would like to see, and I think in the final report that goes to commission, maybe a little more kind of self-reflection about what we could have done better over the course of the past 8 years. I mean, nobody's perfect, though we all love West Hollywood, and really be honest and candid about some of the trade-offs that we're going to have to make as we track toward making some of these changes. I mean, we already know that, people, especially members of the public at meetings, we talked about this at a recent meeting, I think in May or June, about, misunderstandings about the way something is zoned and how big it can actually be based on things like, density bonuses, concessions and things of that nature that people are able to automatically get by building more affordable housing. So I would like to see, like, where do we want to change? And I guess just be a little more like self-critical about what we've done over the course of the past 8 years and how we can improve upon those. I mean, I know, we've built so much housing in the city over the course of the past 8 years, and prices continue to rise, and people still need housing. The demand is still high. So how can we change the kind of housing that we're building to address the demand so that people can actually afford to live here. I have so much stuff written down, but those are my comments for right now. I know that's a lot to synthesize, but I did want to give all of my feedback about that. So I will stop talking now and give the floor to another commissioner.
Any other questions or comments? If not, I will put in my 39 cents. First of all, I'd like to say thank you to everybody for, pitching in on the 5th Thursday. Not anyone's idea of a hot time in the old town tonight, but I think that when this topic first came up, I kind of saw the need for this conversation. And I feel like we've had a really good and robust conversation, and we needed the time and the space for that. So I want to thank staff and everybody for pitching in to do that. You know what, David, before I finish my comments, do we have any public?
Chair, I received no public comments on this item. If there is anybody on the platform with us, please hit *9 for me, and we can give you an opportunity to speak on this item. And it looks like we are all clear, Chair.
Okay, thank you. For the record, I'm probably going to start bringing in ringers so we have some public comment in the future. I'm teasing. Okay. That said, I would second exactly Vice Chair Jones' comments about us being unfairly penalized. I feel like so many of the rules that the state has written have been to address jurisdictions that have, let's just say, been less productive than we have. And we are suffering the effects of that, and in some respects greatly. And yes, we have built a lot of housing, but a lot of it is still vacant and a lot of it is very expensive. One of the statistics that I feel would be really important to add, and maybe I missed it in the technical report, but the percentage of our residents who actually work here. Back to the concept of live work and sort of touching on what Vice Chair Jones was talking about, living thanks to the COVID, et cetera. But one of our goals, I believe, is to encourage housing for people who work here. And some of that comes down to, people who work in our hotels and in our restaurants and other entertainment venues. But, and back to reducing the need for cars and et cetera, that what is our ability to really look at what percentage of our population already is both lives and works within the city. And is that one of our goals, to really encourage that, encourage more production of housing for people who work here and more live work type housing? One of the things I didn't see in all of this is the configuration of some of the housing that we want to encourage, that maybe is more, a studio with a den that allows for a Zoom room, if you will, in an apartment. Some really start thinking about the nature of the housing, and that might drive some of the goals and proposals. Related to that, I'd like us to really consider unit size, and when it comes to multifamily, the whole discussion around FAR. When we've had this conversation in terms, especially of meeting state goals in commercial mixed use buildings, the whole calculation of units is this sort of convoluted back end calculation that says, I want to build this many units and therefore it's FAR. It's very confusing. It's not well defined. And it doesn't, I believe, maximize the number of units possible. And so I think just somehow incorporating that in our goals and our procedures of things we want to do is really revisiting what is the nature of the housing that we want to encourage. You know, do we want micro units? Do we want live work studios? Is that something we want to encourage more? And if so, how would we do that?
So are you telling us, yes, we should encourage that? I mean, that's what this meeting is for you to help direct us of saying, yes, we want to encourage micro units, or no, we don't.
Well, I guess, you know, if you're going to say you want to be able to provide housing for someone who works in hotel, then maybe, you know, a micro unit is the kind of housing that we would want to encourage. Something that's affordable for someone who's working managing staff at a hotel, or something that can't afford, you know, $4,000 a month at the Domain, but wants to, you know, be able to walk to work. And at this time, that really isn't an option for pretty much anybody who works in our service industries in our city. The affordability isn't there unless you can get an affordable unit, unless, you know, you've had a unit for ages. That affordability isn't a possibility. And so we import all of our workers and make them sit on the bus for hours to go back to a place they can afford to live in. Is that who we really are? Are we, you know, are we really truly being inclusionary? So some pieces to that, back to the data, I'm just going to jump around a little bit too. On page 43 of the physical 43 of the technical background report, it's been referred to a couple of times here in this age of housing stock. I think that these statistics are a little bit misleading, because this conflates single family homes with multifamily units. And I think it would be very important from a true housing affordability standpoint to segregate single family homes from multifamily units and look at that age of that housing stock differently. Because I know for a fact that a large chunk of that 1939 or older are single family bungalows. A large chunk of those are in WeHo West. And yes, they're old, but they've been maintained, they've been upgraded, they've been, you know, they're old, but they aren't going anywhere. So I think that when we really start looking at this data in terms of our multifamily, there's going to be quite a shift in this bar graph. And I, for one, would very much like to see that. And I think that might inform some of our decisions differently. I had a question on page 120 of the technical report. This gets into the sites analysis. In the opportunity and underutilized sites. And in here are the Southern California Gas Company site, the Sunset Plaza Overflow parking lot, and the Metro Station and Sheriff site. Now, this is in here as 477 units, but then there's this really interesting column at the end that says feasible for lower income units. And it says no, that huge piece of property at the heart of the city that is the bus depot and the sheriff station, if developed, is not feasible for lower income units. Can someone explain that?
Yeah, hi, this is Ryan with Rincon Consultants. So that's just has to deal with HCD's requirements for site sizes. So they only allow you to utilize lower income units for sites that are half an acre to 10 acres. And so that site is greater than 10 acres. So we can use the units for lower income just because of the state requirements.
But if that site was split, then it could.
Yeah, I guess feasibly it could definitely accommodate lower income units. And if lower income units were to be developed on that site, it would count towards the city's housing.
Arena numbers.
Yeah.
Okay, but then can you explain why three other sites that are lower than 10 acres on Sunset, Alfred, and Willoughby say that it's not feasible for lower income units?
So for Alfred, I believe that was because it was just due to the previous housing element. They identified that site as having higher above moderate units. And then let's see.
Is it because it's not a half acre that it says no for those 3 sites that you're referencing? That was my.
For Alfred, that's the case.
Willoughby, Alfred, and the last Sunset on the list.
Yeah.
So those are too small?
Yeah, so it has to be greater than half an acre.
Okay, because that's a lot of units that are poof.
And the reality is that we can still build affordable housing on these sites, and there will be affordable housing, at least in part, on these sites. But as far as how we calculate it in the site's inventory, we're limited. But again, whatever is actually built on the ground is what ends up being counted. It doesn't preclude any affordable units from being constructed on any of those sites.
Perhaps that might be useful to explain that in this section a little bit more clearly, so that, because I looked at that and said, 477 units and ain't none of them affordable. How is that possible? So having that more clearly explained would probably be very helpful. I think we already talked about FAR. I think that, kind of gets to the bulk of my conversation. And without getting hugely into the weeds, you've got my sort of top level comments. And obviously there's, a few trees died tonight in service of this project. And more will probably die before this is done. But I think the biggest point that I really have is, back to really looking at what do we want this city to look like 10 years from now, and is what we're proposing going to help us get there? It's Commissioner Caballero.
Thank you. John Kehoe, is it not clear that we want micro units? And is it something that we need to spell out? Because, I've been promoting it since I've been on Planning Commission. I think it's the right way to go. I was sort of surprised by your question. I would think that, it would just be part of this conversation. For years, I've always thought that we should look to Tokyo as a model for housing. It's like 4 people live in 600 square feet, and here we have average units of 1,200. And just in regards to making our carbon footprint smaller, it seems like micro units, or like the housing project that's coming to us next week at the corner of Fountain and Fairfax, those type of alternative housing projects should definitely be part of this conversation. Do we need to make that more clear? Has Planning Commission not been clear on those points?
Well, currently there aren't any regulations that prevent, from a zoning standpoint, micro units. I mean, yes, there are now parking requirements associated, but we don't have anything that says units have to be more than, let's say, 600 square feet. You can design a project as small as you want, as long as you meet building codes and that type of thing. I think one of the policies, and maybe Rachel or Allison can talk about it, actually address the different types of housing that we want to take a look at, which included co-living and that type
Yeah,
of
John, I can jump in. So it's H31 is the goal. And it's facilitate the development of a diverse range of housing options, including but not limited to single family homes, ADUs, multifamily rental, condos, and then we go into live work, mixed use, and other flexible housing types like co-living, micro units or efficiency units, congregate housing, residential and commercial subdivisions, and permanent supportive. And then in our programs, how we propose to meet that said goal, most of those are in program 17, which is on page 18 and 19. It's split across the two. And so specifically in the timeframes and objectives, it's asking us to further explore that. And so that would be something that long range, UDAS, Rick's group, and then community services, that's how that would kind of translate into actionable items for the next 8 years.
Great, so it's there.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm definitely a proponent of that, and I look at it from sort of a carbon footprint point of view. We should be moving in that direction, just generally, and smaller housing is a part of that. So yeah, if it needs to be stated, I'm happy to make that statement. I think those alternative housing options are definitely something that we should consider moving forward. Period.
And I guess to my point, there's a difference between not preventing and encouraging. And there's a very large difference. And back to my original statement is, what do we want to look like? What do we want to encourage? How do we want our built environment to look when this element is done? And
we would like you to tell us, is instead of just saying, what do we want? It'd be really helpful to us to hear you say, I would like the housing element to encourage that. So that way we can get that information to then try to put it in there. So are we hearing that you say
that we should encourage micro units? Some of the other configurations I have graver concerns about, but certainly micro units I don't have a problem with. I basically lived in one when I first moved to West Hollywood. So I think it has a place for our community and for our demographic, which has a large percentage of population that sort of tends to be, under 30 and yet wants to live and work here. I'm fine with saying encourage it.
Okay, great.
Now, I don't know how everyone else feels, and I don't want to be the lone voice, and I don't think, well, I'm not, because Commissioner Caballero agrees with me.
I mean, for me, it's not a demographic thing. It's a fundamental shift in consciousness, and if we are going to deal with global warming, if we are going to be green, if we are going to reduce our carbon footprint, it's a shift that needs to happen across the board. And wouldn't it be amazing if our community made that shift and then we really encourage that, sort of smaller housing, like, Tokyo, a family of 4 lives in a unit of 600 square feet, and they have done for hundreds of years. So it is a change of understanding and how we live and cohabitate our space or live with our spaces. But I'd like to see sort of us move in that direction. And some of these other, housing experiments, it's like they're equally, I don't see the problems that possibly could result in them, but it'd be interesting to at least explore the possibility of trying to introduce some of those alternative housing projects to our urban fabric.
And having a clear, thorough study of the potential pitfalls as well as the opportunities of these different schemas, if you will, and what do we need to address. And
so like another example. So, many years ago, one of the ways we tried to encourage housing on the boulevard was kind of in the negative. We created an average unit size in our residential zones. So that meant we weren't going to get a whole bunch of big units in the residential zones because they had to average a certain size. But we left open our commercial zones. We didn't put that in the commercial zones. And so we said, if someone wants to build luxury condos in the commercial zones, go for it. And so that was one of the ideas of saying, okay, move those over to those areas. And obviously we've certainly seen in the press some pretty phenomenally large and expensive condos. When you talk about, is that the vision for the city? So this is the opportunity for the commission to say, the vision of our city is not to have, 10,000 square foot, multi-million-dollar condos. So maybe we should look at doing something to the unit size in commercial zones. I'm just throwing that out as an example.
Or to say, if you want to build that, here are the costs to building that. Here's how many affordable housing units you have to build regardless. There are a lot of different ways to look at this. You don't necessarily want to completely hamstring a developer, but by the same token, the goal is to guide what our city is going to look like. And is it going to be all, Bentleys and Lamborghinis, or, is it still a working person's city? And my personal goal would to keep it a working person's city. That's who we are.
I have a few things to maybe add to this, and I'm in complete agreement with what I'm hearing from you, Chair Hoopengarner, and the commissioners. I think we really should take a look at a really high level of what do we want our city to be, and how can we make it unique? How can we make people want to live here? Knowing that West Hollywood is a creative city, I think the idea of micro units totally makes sense. I guess one thing to maybe think about, and just an idea, also creating a sense of community. Are there ways that we can have buildings that sort of carry a theme? Is there a way that there can be an incentive of some sort where, for instance, a building is a live work and it's artist in residency, and maybe there's an incentive there that allows for a certain other bonus or grant or something like that. Those might be interesting things to consider as well. Just kind of thinking about, okay, you put a micro unit in West Hollywood. What makes it West Hollywood? How can we make it the best possible thing that it can be? And how can we help kind of facilitate that as a city? I know that also there's some suggestions into eliminating the requirement for parking. So I think maybe, the reality is cars are sometimes needed. So maybe something we should look at with zoning as well is if there's car share zones. So you think about, like in Europe, sometimes you see this where there are cars that are in the city that are in, parked city streets that you can take when you need a car. That may actually alleviate some of the load within our city, because people won't feel like they're required to have a car and have a car parked and take up that valuable space when they're not going to use it every day. And that could also interconnect with live work as well. So, the idea that you're not commuting, but you're rather living in West Hollywood and working in West Hollywood, since that's not necessarily the case for everyone. Those people also might really appreciate something like having a car share kind of system within the city. And that might actually reduce some of the congestion that we're seeing and also allow for more units rather than just more parking, without the sort of, counters maybe argument to it that there's a need for that parking, if that makes sense. So those are just a couple of ideas to put out there as well, that maybe would be in support of the ideas that, micro units are acceptable and something we should definitely look at within zoning. And also just to circle back to transit, where transit points are, and certainly how we can try to help identify where we want things to get denser in the city, and help direct that a little bit more, because it seems like it's not necessarily, it's kind of happening where it happens at the moment, and maybe not as much where we would wish it to as a community.
Thank you. I will, tag on to that, back to, the FAR issue in the commercial zones, and why we are looking at these ginormous penthouse suites, et cetera, maybe it's time to revisit the concept of a maximum average square footage in the commercial zones. The conversation I know has been had in the past, but a lot has changed since that conversation last transpired. And I think it happened at council. And it's perhaps time to revisit the concept of maximum square footage in the commercial zones. It doesn't have to be prohibitive, but let's look at, again, who are we and what do we want to be? you know, tied to that, I'd like to skip on to a couple of the rest of the things on my list. I'm going to respectfully disagree with the vice chair on the individual metering subject. To me, that is very much a green initiative item, and I would actually change the language from allow to require individual metering, because that brings a level of awareness to individual unit holders as to what they're actually spending in terms of energy and water. Water in particular, it's a huge item. It's as you all know, right now, we're just in a massive drought, and it's only going to get worse until we can all hope and pray we have wonderful rains again this winter. And individual metering in multifamily units, to me, is one way to truly bring into relief to the individual unit holder what they're spending, because they have to spend it when they take that 30-minute shower. Right now, we've got people taking these huge showers, and it's on the landlord to pay for that water and the rest of us. So requiring may be a little harsh. There may be some other mid point there, but to me, that is a huge green issue, and one way we can really make it, bring it into relief for our residents as to what it costs, because it's costing them directly for their usage personally. I'd also like to go back to some of the conversations about preserving our existing inventory. And I think there's some creative ways that we can look at keeping our existing buildings and preserving our existing rent controlled, not rent controlled, but stabilized units. And there's ways to help incentivize landlords and meet multiple goals at the same time. So let's say, for example, that a landlord has a number of units. Is there a way for us to use some of our affordable in lieu fees, for example, to say to a landlord, okay, you've got a couple of units here that you really want to spend money on to rehab them, but you don't have a lot of money. Here's some cash to rehab, and in exchange, you'll allow us to move one of these units into an affordable, and you'll be able to keep the other unit at a market rate, and we'll pay for it. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Commissioner Caballero, but you know, building a unit in this town is what, $600,000, $700,000 per unit, and I would imagine you could have an existing unit at substantially less than that and get an affordable unit without having to build it new, keep it in, you know, existing inventory. And since it's a new affordable unit, wouldn't it count towards our RENA number?
No, I mean, I think so there's a few things. One, the trust fund we couldn't use unless the existing tenant was low income, we could not use trust fund dollars. And the second item is we are looking at creative ways, largely outside of the trust fund, because many of these occupants are not low income. But as Veronica was highlighting, you know, the loss of redevelopment was huge for the city in 2012, and you see that reflected in our ability. But you know, part of the items for the program on rehabilitation is to look at from the state, from even the city, even at looking at how we're developing our currently city-owned sites, about how we could create a new fund through that project and have it trickle down into a new sort of fund. And likely to really have the impact we want to do, it has to be a new sort of fund. The difficulty there is currently we can't really leverage it. And so one of the advantages of our affordable units is that, yeah, it costs $700,000 to build a tax credit unit, but the city subsidy is usually $125,000 to $150,000 per unit. Whereas these, you know, to rehabilitate an existing unit, you're talking at a minimum $300K. So one of the things we're trying to do is figure out how to leverage dollars, our limited local dollars, to maximize our ability to help these properties that aren't low income, but are naturally occurring affordable. And we know that that's a priority for the you know, the next 10 years and also the next 25, 30 years.
To be clear, I was not speaking about currently occupied units. So that there would
Okay,
be.
if they were vacant, I think there'd be a possibility for sure, if they were vacant units.
And I find it hard to believe. It obviously depends on the unit and what's required, but $250,000 to rehab, that sounds pretty excessive. But anyway.
Yeah, I'm talking generally about our buildings that are 100 years old that need dramatic structural improvements. And the other creative, in talking with our climate action plan is how many of these are really tied into climate action goals, and trying to see what, leverage funds that we can dive into. Because really when you update these old buildings and all of the systems that are really, yes, you need new plumbing, but what you need to do is really think about the whole, the entire system of the building, not a specific unit. And so those are obviously going to be very expensive, but there's so much money coming down the pipe for climate projects. And so how we can tie our climate action plan and our housing plan together, much of it depends on where funding is coming from in the next 10 years, but it's something that we're working hard to partner on.
Yeah, I just want us to be creative in our thinking and our approach to some of these ways to really look at truly preserving. I mean, the easiest way to have an affordable unit is to keep an existing affordable unit and not have to build a new one. And so, ideas like, if let's say you have a senior that's on an upper story in a building and, they really want to relocate to the ground floor because of accessibility issues. But if they move, they lose their rent stabilization, et cetera, et cetera. Is there a way for us to create a program where we incentivize, some minor rehab for the landlord that allows that senior to move, stay rent stabilized in the same building, but in a lower and more accessible floor? Just some thoughts around on that kind of really looking at our existing citizens and how we can help them as much as building, a bunch of new affordable housing for those people in Nebraska who want to move here. Not that I don't love those people from Nebraska, but hello, we have people here that we'd like to take care of. I think that's the bulk of my comments at this time. Did anyone else have anything else they wanted? Vice Chair Jones?
I just want to add one thing, and that's that, a lot of the existing units are not handicapped accessible. So it's just something that I think is important to note.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Commissioner Carvajero.
Yeah, in regards to your comments about, preserving and conserving what we have versus, who we want to be. And, if we take the position that we do want units to become smaller because we want to have smaller carbon footprints, we want to be more efficient city, then, maybe that's the long-term goal. The short-term goal is we conserve what we have, but there has to come a time where those units have to shift. We don't need to have one person living in a 2,000 square foot unit, and we want them to be living in more efficient units. So I guess it goes back to your comment, like, where are we going and how do we give, and I'm not understanding exactly how we give direction to staff in regards to that. Do we need to have, we can't have this discussion, or maybe we have this discussion here, in this format, as to where do we want to go? That's one comment. And then the other comment, and building on what Commissioner Lombardi was saying, which I think is completely right on, is like moving micro units to our commercial zones, and where we have transit just makes sense because it alleviates the parking requirement. Is that something that we want to have staff study? So I'm just saying those are the things that I'm interested in, and I'm not quite certain how we ask staff to do that, or is that something that you just continue to explore as you work out this housing element report?
And see, to me, I agree with you, and that's why I was hedging, because I don't really feel comfortable saying, well, I think this is where it should be, because
right.
I don't feel comfortable. And in my world, I mean, I'm a management consultant. How would we do this? We would have some serious brainstorming sessions with key players. In your world, you would call it a charrette, right?
Yeah, an extensive one. It would be an extensive one, but maybe just
what I'm thinking of is maybe, I don't know if we have a slide that shows the different categories of goals, policies, implementation, that type of thing. So the idea is, do we have a goal that can incorporate the ideas that you have? And then you go down the list to, is there something identifying that we need to investigate, over time, shifting the city to smaller units?
Yeah.
And then that creates that in-depth discussion at a future date when we're going through that public process. So we go from like, we want affordable housing or more affordable housing, and then you go through the policies and objectives, and then is there the strategy that allows us to then have that really intense discussion?
Yeah,
Yeah, John, I'm wondering if we can look at program 20. So it talks about program 20. This is in the housing element. It's the page 21. And so the first bullet there is consider amending density standards to allow more units to be constructed. And then the other one that we've been talking about a little bit, mini on parking and shared parking. So we have another item under 20 about change, reduce, eliminate certain parking requirements, allow for shared parking and unbundling of parking to allow parking to be sold separately, and evaluate potential modifications to parking size standards. And there's a few here on number 20 that I think maybe are touching. And so part of this too, like what John was saying, is for you to specifically point to us and say, I'm not sure if that's the right thing to be, to have as the program, or maybe it is, or maybe it's different.
See, to me, this is the reason that the city council, created the urban design studio. This is precisely the conversation that an urban design studio would be looking at.
So it's also long range planning. This is precisely why long range planning exists.
I mean, what's exciting to this, that this really ties the future of housing with climate management and smaller carbon footprints, and sort of looks at it holistically, which is something that really excites me as part of this conversation.
Exactly. So I think, to me, this is, if it were me doing my job in my world, it would be, bringing in, say, UDAS and, key players, and having some serious brainstorming sessions, really coming up with, a Chinese laundry list of things and how they interact and how they interplay, and what the potential consequences are, and really look at them in the whole built environment, and having a really robust conversation, and having that in this environment is, to me, just not very doable.
Yeah, and clearly we have the talent in the city to do it. So maybe the direct of this conversation is enough to inspire that research.
So what I'm trying to get at is, we hear the commissioners identifying where they would like us to go. Do we have policies and goals, strategies that allow us to have those conversations? I agree with you that we need to have those robust conversations, and they're not tonight. But we want to know, like, what are your ideas? And so do we have enough direction in our plan that allows us in 6 months or a year from now to have those conversations?
Well, I'd like to ask a question of legal in regards to that. We're being asked to sort of lock down this 8-year plan of these housing elements with all this stuff in it, which are going to show up in our findings. What is our ability to edit that throughout the course of the 8 years? If we're being locked down by the state and saying, well, here's your 8-year plan, and there you go, do we have the ability 9 months from now to go, yeah, well, we changed our minds and we want to edit this?
Well, for other elements of the general plan, we can edit them throughout the course. When this is certified by HCD, I think it becomes a little more challenging. And I think that's what John was saying. These aren't just simple rules that you're telling the staff to put in. There's a plan. It's goals, policies, implementation items. And so the more that, I think tonight what John's asking for is, do the goals and the policies get to these things you're talking about? And then when we implement, that's where there's flexibility. That's where there's brainstorming. That's where the real work happens. But we just have to know what our goals and how we're going to get there in this document. And we want to be flexible enough. That's why John said you use words like encourage, consider, look into all these things. And those are not, strict absolute rules of what they will be. They're getting you to the concepts. A lot of the things you're talking about tonight about promoting green building and, being and smaller units, all these things, those are the bigger concepts that would be really helpful for staff if you could, tell them that this document does that or it doesn't and it needs more description in certain areas. And we'll come back and have those really big brainstorming sessions and implementing sessions later on.
That's interesting. I mean, for me, just from my perspective and what has interested me in the past, I guess I would say that my interest would be tying the housing element with climate action by reducing the maximum square footage of units in the future, and how we can use our successive housing element studies to get there. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. I think that sort of captures the essence of the idea.
And you know what, that actually triggers the question, because if we look at where all of those mega mansions came from on our penthouses, et cetera, they came from development agreements. They did not come as the result of our standard code. So I guess, I'm not picking on them per se. I'm just using that as an example.
Yeah, I understand.
Development agreement. What do we do about that?
Just to kind of add to what you were saying before, Lynn, regarding amending the plan. Well, we can't exactly amend the plan. Every single year we'll need to check in with the state on the programs. And at that point, that's where we can say to the state, hey, we're looking at adjusting our programs to continue to further meet our goals. So there's always an opportunity to adjust the programs themselves.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would just add that staff is constantly looking at all of our various plans, our ped and bike plan, our climate action plan. We have a rail integration study going on, housing element. We're doing a number of these things concurrently and trying to make sure they all kind of reference each other, because Commissioner Lombardi and all of you are correct that all of these things are interrelated. Yep. We have a number of goals that are in line with each other and also at sometimes conflict with each other. And staff can definitely be on point to make sure that we're resolving those issues. I mean, we hear you tonight, we hear the direction tonight. And so we'll look back through a number of those housing program elements to make sure that for the final iteration of this in December, we come back with some of those suggestions reflected at that time.
Well, great. Commissioner Dutta, you had more? Yay.
I'll keep it brief. Just wanted to touch upon a couple of the things that were already mentioned. To Commissioner Lombardi's point about micro units and having shared car services built into those types of properties. The only micro unit property I've ever visited before was in San Francisco, and they had a zip car set up in the actual building. That might not be like something that could happen every time, but it definitely worked well. The property is also very transit adjacent as well. So it helps serve the purpose of being near transit, but at the same time, like Commissioner Lombardi mentioned, cars are going to be necessary in some instances. So this helped eliminate the need for parking for each of those units while also still accommodating those who needed a car. So we just wanted to mention that worked really well, in my opinion. I do also concur with you, Chair Hoopengarner, on the individual metering for water and energy consumption. I say that having spent a lot of my recent career working on multifamily properties, as well as analyzing the actual energy and water usage of those properties and seeing the differences between properties that are master metered for utilities versus ones that are individually, and there is a big difference in what's being consumed inside the units. The language says allow individually metering for water and energy consumption. So I guess my question is, has it not been allowed, or is one utility not allowed versus the other at this moment? Or is it, or I think it was also, you also alluded to it earlier, if the language should say more encourage rather than allow. So that would be, and then also my understanding is if it's an affordable property and it is individually metered, that then the utility allowance would increase for that tenant. Someone correct me if I'm wrong about the understanding as to how that would impact the utility allowance for that individual tenant if they are now covering water as well, for example, which is typically not something that most properties require the tenants to pay for.
Yeah, there's a max tenant utility allowance built into all of these regulatory programs, and it outlines what specific utilities can be included in that max. And so that's the max that can pass on to the tenant on the affordable side.
On the affordable side. But yep. I think that point though, the question, this gets back to what incentives for what, right? You know, if you put in individual metering, well, then maybe, you know, you get X, what are our real things that we want to incentivize, and what, you know, do we want to offer as in exchange for that?
I just had a few other comments about just the documents in general that I had listed here. On the actual housing element draft on page 15, I believe, there is reference to consider amending residential zone density to realign with requirements from County of LA prior to cityhood. I guess I'm just wondering what's the impact of that and what's the reasoning for considering that?
So we had a specific request from a council member related to this program in order to help us revert back to the densities that were allowed in our area prior to cityhood. That's basically the R3 and R4 zone districts had higher densities that were actually reduced upon the creation of West Hollywood. So looking at reverting back to those levels to allow for an increased density in R3 and R4 throughout the city.
Okay, thank you. That makes sense. And then my last comment is on the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing attachment. It looks like the Metro map is an older map, so I just noticed that can probably be updated with the new one.
We'll update that. If there are no further comments specific to this, I'd love to just finish the presentation to provide information on next steps and where people can provide additional information. Did you have more, Lynn?
I'm sorry, I did. And this is a clarification back on the sites. And Rachel, I think we spoke about this earlier, but I'm still confused. So, and I think it bears bringing up because it was brought up by the public the last time around. And I am going to page 113 and 114 of the technical exhibit B. And this is the list of pending projects. So maybe this is just helping me understand the difference between approved projects and pending projects. And you have a list of approved projects, which it says have received planning approval, but have not applied for a building permit. Okay, that's that list. And that's on page 109. But then we go to page 111 and we go to pending projects, which says that they are pending planning approval. But on that list are things that are in construction. So, and you said earlier today in our phone conversation, oh, that's okay, we can still include them because, and I still don't understand, because the definition here says that they're pending planning approval, but there's things on the list that are physically in construction right now. So help me understand that.
So I think what we're missing in our conversation, we were talking about a project on Santa Monica Boulevard that's under construction. Previously, we thought we were going to have to eliminate it from the list since they did pull a building permit. But since it won't be completed, it can be included, excuse me, I suppose it can be moved to entitled or approved. Part of the issue was we weren't including any projects that included building permits. So previously thought we wouldn't count that property. Like I said, because it won't be completed before October, we can include it. So we'll need to include it, move it to table 1, but then also clarify that there are projects that do have building permits and are under construction and how that meets state law.
And I think Veronica can add in, she's had some experience with already getting housing elements through, and there's been some clarification directly from HCD that's very technical, but it's now tied to this project not being completed by October 15th, 2021. And Veronica, I know you've got.
If we could just, and we don't need to spend more time on this, but if you just make your tables, break it out. So here's what's approved but not started. Here's what's approved and started and won't be done by the time the element's done, you know, blah, blah, blah. Then it would make sense, because you've got stuff here that I can see the crane from here, you know. So if we can just clarify that, because it doesn't, the words don't match the data.
We can absolutely do that.
Okay, that's all. Thank you. And last call for comments, questions, last call for the public. David, have they magically appeared? No magic, David? Okay, then we'll move on.
I'm sorry, no, Chair.
Okay, we'll move on to Rachel and your closing remarks.
Thank you so much, commissioners, for your time this evening. I did want to review the next steps. In August, next month, we'll be going to the Transportation Commission, Historic Preservation Commission, Rent Stabilization Board, and the Senior Advisory Board to present them with the same drafts and get their input in particular things that apply to their purview. We'll go to City Council September 20th for their review prior to a 60-day review by HCD, which we anticipate submitting in late September. As we said previously as well, the draft is actually on our website now, and we're open for public comment on this draft that we would like to receive by September 1st of this year. So if anyone has any comments or would like to read the current draft, you can go to our website, weho.org/housing element. And then as we're doing the HCD preliminary 60-day review, we'll also be wrapping up our environmental impact report and putting that out for public review, ultimately culminating in a public hearing and adoption of the housing element, as well as certification of the environmental impact report in December and January, followed by HCD submittal and certification as required by state law by February of 2022. So as I said, we are looking for comments on the draft by September 1st, and you can do so by going to our website, weho.org/housing element. Again, thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to hearing from the public as well.
Okay, thank you, Rachel, Robin, and team. Lot of material to go through for you and for us. Just consuming it was daunting enough. I can't imagine compiling it, indexing it, all those good things. And the fun is not done. All right, let's move on then to item 13, excluded consent calendar. There are none. Item 14, items from staff. A, planning manager update. Robin, are you on deck?
I am, yes. I'm going to go through just the month of August in terms of upcoming meetings agendas. So for the August 5th meeting next week, we have a continued, I guess 8901 Sunset Boulevard has been actually continued to October 7th. So I just want to acknowledge that. But we will have 9009 to 9015 Sunset Boulevard on deck, and then 1301 to 1307 North Fairfax Avenue, which is the construction of a 5-story, 17-unit apartment building for the next meeting. And then on August 19th, we have another billboard, 9165 to 69 Sunset Boulevard, and then a new bar consideration, 9159 Sunset Boulevard. And that's it.
Thank you. I would ask, given that that August 5th date is a week from today, I don't have anything in my inbox for that that package. Is there something missing here, or has that not gone out?
I can respond to that, Chair. No, we couldn't actually release it until this meeting has concluded. So you'll get all your packet materials, and hopefully the printed plans will be ready for your pickup tomorrow. And it'll be legally posted tomorrow. But we couldn't do that until this meeting is concluded.
just give me a minute, okay?
Okay.
Alright. Thank you. Then if there's no other questions for Robin, let's move on to item 15, public comment. David, do we have public?
I received no public comment on this item, and it looks like we are all clear.
Gonna start taking it personally. Okay, item 16, items from commissioners. Item A, commissioner comments. Do we have any? I do have one, and it's also a question for our esteemed city legal attorney type person. Ms. Langer, a number of months ago, you and I had a discussion about the fact that there's this new state law that says you can only have so many meetings for certain projects under these new laws, and that you were going to outline what qualified and what didn't, because one of my questions was, well, wait a minute, does a neighborhood meeting count as one of the 5 meetings? And, you know, if it has to go to HPC, but, you know, there's certain rules that, you know, what it has to do, and it exceeds the 5, what happens? And you were going to come back with some explanations on that. That's looking more and more important based on some of the things that have been happening recently. Where do we stand?
Yeah, so a couple things. We were actually planning on doing a training on SB 330 right before COVID, and that got off track. But I've actually been working with Jennifer Alkire to get that scheduled, and I think we're going to be doing a training in the next few months. In fact, one of my colleagues who's going to help me with the training was actually just on listening to this housing element discussion, but he signed off at the end. Otherwise, it would have been a good opportunity for me to introduce you. But anyway, I digress. We're going to come back and talk about that very soon. Also, there are some recent changes to the state law that are being considered to help clarify how many meetings can be had, whether it includes appeals or not. So we've been in conversations up in Sacramento to try and get some of that language clarified. So it's a strange part of the state law that's new and something we haven't dealt with before, especially in a city where we have public hearings on EIRs and we have neighborhood meetings and we have a lot of public input, and we want to keep a lot of that public input. So so we can provide some more concrete information, and hopefully the Sacramento will be clarifying some of the requirements moving forward as well.
And I would think that one of those conversations would be around, okay, if that's the limit, can we hold an HPC hearing and a planning commission hearing at same time, same station, and just close one and open another and call it one meeting? You know, these are all questions that I think we would probably want to get clarified. Super. Okay. Commissioner Caballero.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the calendar. And Robin, do we still have design review on August 26th?
I was just going to bring that up.
Because then we have a planning commission meeting September 2nd, the following week.
Yes.
So, I mean, it's almost, we have, something almost every Thursday this month.
Well, as we spoke at our last meeting, one of the problems with August 26th was Commissioner Lombardi's worldwide gallivanting.
Right.
And the fact that I will be needing to recuse myself from one of the items on that calendar. So the August 26th calendar was looking really problematic. We had a meeting today to discuss precisely that, at which Mr. Lombardi informed us that, God willing, and the flight schedule not getting messed up, he will be able to attend on the 26th, so that we will have all 3 of us there, with me recusing myself from the one project.
Got it. Okay.
So,
yeah, just to add to that, part of why I was kind of a little uncertain in the last meeting. So yeah, happy to provide an update. I have a pretty good buffer of like 5+ hours. So I think I should be able to join that meeting on the 26th, which I think was the main issue, especially with Chair Hoopen-Gardner needing to recuse herself from part of that meeting. The second, which is a planning commission meeting, I have a meeting on top of that meeting, so that will be a true conflict, as well as I think there may potentially be a design review, or I guess a SASE meeting the following Thursday. That would be the 9th. Yeah, but it seemed like the 26th was the difficult date, and I think that's worked out on my end.
Yeah, and if you miss planning commission, well, there's still 6 of us, and Sassy, Commissioner Jones and I will at least still be there. Although it does bring up the question about alternates again, Ms. Langer. And it really was pretty ugly. And one of the problems is we're looking at, a very large project on the 26th, and then the following month for design review, another very large project. And so, life happens, and the need for considering accommodating an alternate I see it as increasing. And I will once again submit that we have a very talented and accurate and thorough secretary who can keep track of who's done what and keep us out of trouble. I will just leave it there, but to me, having a substitute, an alternate, a bonus person, whatever name you want to use, would be beneficial, in my humble opinion. So I will leave it there because I know you disagree. So I don't know what our recourse is for disagreement arbitration. But I think for the short term, we've got the 26th resolved. Obviously, if something happens, and we'll have to, reschedule, and there'll just be nothing for it. So, okay, so that sort of segged into item 16B, subcommittee management. Are there any other commissioner comments or subcommittee management, since we're kind of conflating the two? Nothing? Okay, with that, I hereby adjourn this planning commission meeting until the next regularly scheduled meeting on Thursday, August 5th, 2021, beginning at 6:30 p.m. on Zoom. And with that, everyone, it's the end of July. It's day 403, something like that. And be safe out there, everybody. And I will see you virtually in a week. Bye.
Thank you. Good night.